women were not just engaging in how we in the global north understand as care labor, which is cooking and cleaning and caring for the children and caring for the ill, but they were engaged in all of these things that in one level we might understand as production, but because it happens within the household sphere or the domestic sphere is not counted as production, right? It becomes part of just things that women do because they're idle. I am Sirisha Naidu, and I'm associate professor at University of Missouri, Kansas City. When we think about economics, or when we think about theory or behavior, whether we're talking about economists, whether we're talking about people, most people don't understand how many assumptions we're making in order to make sense of the world, right? And how many of these assumptions themselves come to us from other thinkers, whether they're political thinkers, they're economic thinkers. And one of the assumptions that people make is that all productive activity, what we also understand as GDP, right? Like all productive activity happens in the market. And this is a view that economists from different spectrums of the political aisle, this is a view that they held. And so in the 1970s, a bunch of feminist and particularly Marxist feminist economists started to challenge this perspective. And these are people like Selma James, Maria Della Costa, Silvia Federici, and they were really challenging the notion of, what counts as productive and what counts as value generating, right? What creates value in the economy? Because this is what people pay attention to. And they were talking about how, in order to generate value, which happens through what we commonly understand as production, and it happens in the market, that the role that domestic labor plays in producing and reproducing workers who themselves are so important to the economy and to the processes of production and to value generation, right? So as much as we need wages, we as in workers need wages to make sure that we survive. We're not actually consuming those wages. They have to be processed in some way. Someone needs to make the food. Someone needs to take care of us when we're ill. Someone needs to raise the kids. Someone needs to inculcate a value system. Someone needs to educate, right? So all of these processes that we typically don't take into account, right? And those are the processes of social reproduction because they not only, they allow not only for the daily reproduction of workers, but also the generational reproduction, right? So when we're talking about reproduction, we're not just talking about biological reproduction. We're talking about all of the different processes that create people and workers, right? And create, hence, workers who then generate value, who then generate production, who then generate all of the things that we enjoy, that we consume, that we participate in. This understanding of social reproduction, wage labor was central, right? So this was happening in the 70s. And then in the 1980s, Maria Mies talked about, from her research on, particularly in India, but then she and her associates did work in the global south in what at that time was referred to as the third world. And they were like, but in all of these other countries, we don't even see wage labor as much, or we do, but that's not the only form of engagement with the economy for most people, right? So if you talk about women particularly, women were not just engaging in how we in the global north understand as care labor, which is cooking and cleaning and caring for the children and caring for the ill, but they were engaged in all of these things that in one level we might understand as production, but because it happens within the household sphere or the domestic sphere is not counted as production, right? It becomes part of just things that women do because they're idle, right? So this could be, for instance, producing food, growing food. This could be even engaging in something called home-based production, which is that you are actually producing something for a company, but you're doing it at home, and so you're not visible. You're not visible in the factory, but you are doing the work. And, but that work is not being counted in any way. So she challenged this idea that even in understanding social reproduction, that are we only going to focus on wage work, or all of this informal work, all of this subsistence production, which is production for consumption, particularly women engage and women in the global south, that we have to take that into account as well in order to understand social reproduction among the diverse economies that we have in the world. Maria Mies was trying to focus on or trying to highlight the fact that women were engaged in so many other different kinds of production activities. And I'm going to call them labor processes because they require labor. So many of these labor processes are not really counted. They don't necessarily take place in the market. Sometimes they may, but the other thing about production and reproduction is where it takes place, right? So if you ask someone about what they understand by production, they're going to think about the factory, they're going to think about the office. More in contemporary times, they might think about some kind of gig work, right? Some kind of, but it's all out in the public sphere, right? Even if it's work from home, there is a publicness to that work, right? Because it goes into the company in some way, right? Whereas a lot of the work that women in the global south were doing was within the private sphere, even though it was creating value. It was actually production. It was maybe production for the company, maybe production for the household and to sustain the household, but all of these different activities. And in doing so, that labor becomes devalued. Another economist called Carmen Diaz, she wrote about it in 1976, and she was talking about Peru, and she argued that, women were particularly, in some ways, economically compelled to engage in these low value in the ways, if you think about it in monetary terms, and devalued, invisible work because profits depend on it. It is because of the work that women do within this kind of invisible sphere, in the sphere that is not typically recognized or not typically valued. It is because of that work that wage labor doesn't have to be compensated as much. You can keep wages low because women are picking up so much of the slack, right? Because how do you sustain the household, right? So you can keep wages low because someone in the background is picking up that work. So if we think about the different labor processes in the global south, right? So you could have people engaged in subsistence production of food, right? So small little plots of land where they're trying to grow food because, clearly they don't have enough money to buy food. Or women walking miles just to get water or firewood because they don't have access to any cooking fuel or they don't have access to heating fuel, right? And so the way that you do that is by putting in your own time and engaging in this sometimes literally backbreaking work. Or it could be, going street to street selling vegetables and fruits, right? Which is, again, not, it's not fun. It's not, sometimes you're walking, sometimes you're, on a bicycle. And all of these different labors contribute, right? Or they contribute to these multiple labor processes in the global south, right? So in 2017, Titi Bhattacharya talked about a circuit of social reproduction. So if we want to really think about the contributions of labor, we have to also talk about the contributions of social reproduction. And so the way she formulated that was to give wage labor the central position, which is that people use money to sustain themselves, and then they engage in wage labor, and then they get paid a wage, and then they use it to sustain themselves. And that's kind of a circuit, it's a circuit of some sort, right? And I kind of reformulated for the global south to bring in all of these different labor processes. It's not just wage labor. It is labor that is not waged. And some of that labor can go into the production of things that capitalist businesses use, such as home-based production, for instance, which women, for instance, will take on jobs, do it at home. It will go into particularly the clothing industry, and then it will be sold in shops, and your brand, it could be branded and sold for a lot of money. But it could also be non-wage labor that is used in order to sustain themselves, which could be production for themselves, for their communities, for household members, right? So all of these, and it could be formal labor, which is that you have a job, a regular job with some job security, with some job benefits, but it could be informal labor, right? And so much of labor in the global south is within this informal sector. So you have to take in all of that diversity. The other thing that I wanted to do with the circuits of social reproduction is to challenge the notion that production happens within a sphere that is different from reproduction. In other words, how do we understand that within the global South perspective, production and reproduction are often blurred? The spaces are blurred, right? So, for instance, where women are engaged in production in the house eventually it makes a profit for someone. It shows up in GDP. It's just that their labor is not, or their labor is not being recognized in that way. It could be, the actual care work of whether it is cooking and cleaning, but it could be producing food so that the person who has a job can actually get fed and then go to their work and actually be productive, right? The ways in which we understand productive. But it's so blurred. Or if you think about reproduction, we can think about the ways in which even businesses start to spread their tentacles into the sphere of reproduction in terms of controlling who can do what, right? And as bizarre as it may seem, and maybe it's not bizarre in our current context in the US, you could have businesses and employers telling you how you can and cannot live, right? So they can start to dictate what kinds of morality. For instance, if you are living in a place that is given to you by your employer, the employer could sometimes come and check in on you. This has happened even in the US context. For instance, Ford factory often sent their managers to workers' homes to ensure that women were being good middle-class wives, right? And so we begin to see ways in which the sphere of production, which happens in a public sphere, but the employers, the capitalist employers, the ways in which they begin to kind of play a role in how reproduction happens within the private sphere. The same as production, which is supposed to happen in the public sphere, can also happen within the private sphere. Or ways in which women workers care for each other within the place of work, right? So they might cover for each other, and those are all relations of care, but they're happening, and they're relations of social reproduction that are happening within the productive public sphere. So what I wanted to do within the circuits of social reproduction is to challenge one, that wage labor is central, but also that there is this distinction between the spheres of where reproduction and production takes place. They are, in fact, so intertwined. And the other thing is that the distinction between production and reproduction doesn't really matter to the workers. Yes, it does matter in terms of social status, in terms of how we understand ourselves. If I have a job and it's well-paying, I feel good about myself. But ultimately, what I really want is to make sure that my household survives, right? And that we have some basic standard of living. And this is particularly true of women, on whom this responsibility is typically imposed on, right? So if if wages are not sufficient, it's the women who go out and say, what else can I do to make sure that the kids are fed, for instance, right? And so this distinction between production, reproduction for the workers in some ways is irrelevant, because what I'm really interested in is making sure that my family survives. We have a decent life.